So I hope you can see my screen for those of you who are on the call. And let's get started. We're going to start a new chapter today, Siman Tes. Up until now, we've been talking about Dine Nizkei Mamon, financial damage. In other words, when you cause damage to a person's property, your liability for damages to pay for the damaged property. Now we're starting chapter 9, Siman Tes, which is about Dine Nizkei Guf Vanefesh, the damages that are caused to a person's body and soul. And what does that mean exactly? Okay, so first, obviously, we know that it's a great crime to cause a person bodily harm. So let's start with that. Asr la'adam lahakos es chavero. It is prohibited by the Torah to strike another person, to strike another Jew. The imhikahu over below sase. And if you do strike him, you violate a negative commandment. Shenemar v'haya im bin hakos harasha. And if this person deserves to be stricken, this wicked man, arba'im yakenu lo yosif, then you shall give him 40 lashes and not do more, pen yosif v'goymer, lest you strike him excessively. Now, here, this doesn't seem to have any connection. Here, the Torah is talking about giving a person malchus who has, let's say, eaten chazer. Okay, guy eats chazer, he gets lashes. What does this have to do with the prohibition of striking someone? So the answer is im hikpida Torah b'hakas rasha shelo lahakoto yoter al risho. So what the Torah is very careful to admonish is do not administer more lashes than what this person is prescribed. It's an isser for the guy in the Beis Din who's giving the whip to give more. The Torah says you may not give more. So if the Torah is telling him you may not hit to the guy who is hitting when justifiably a wicked person, kal v'chomer b'hakas tzaddik. So then surely when it comes to striking a righteous person, there is a prohibition. The Torah prohibits striking a wicked person more than the prescribed amount. So surely the Torah would prohibit striking a righteous person more than he deserves, and he doesn't deserve any. So therefore, you see from here that there's a prohibition of striking someone in any way. V'chol hamerim yad, al chavero lahakoto, afal pi shelo hikahu nikra rasha. And even just lifting up your hand to strike someone, even if you don't end up striking him, that person is called a rasha, an evil person. Shenemar, vayomer la rasha lama takere echa. We'll see this in a few weeks when we read Parsha Shmos, where Moshe sees two Jews arguing, and he turns to one man, and the Torah identifies that one man as a rasha. Why? Because the man had lifted up his hand in a threatening way, about to zetz the other guy. So he says to the wicked man, why would you strike your fellow? Just threatening to strike someone is in itself makes a person be worthy of being called a rasha. Lami hikita lo ne'amar, elo lama takeh. It doesn't say, why did you strike him? Why? It says, why would you strike him? Or why will you strike him? Meaning the fellow was only threatening to do so. Anyone who strikes another Jew is already automatically put in cherem, and this cherem was imposed by earlier generations. It's not like you have to go through a formal process. You automatically, anyone who is known to be a zetzer, so he's like sort of on the outs automatically. Ve'ein letzarfo leminyan asur, you cannot even count him as part of a minyan. Ulachol davar shebikdusha, or any other kind of matter which requires a minyan for sanctity, perhaps maybe a zimun as well. Adshi atiru lo beis din hacherim kishemekabel alav lishma ledinam, until the beis din actually proactively lifts the cherem after hearing him say that he will now submit to the authority, to their authority, and he will listen to them. Now, you might think that's like this is so. We're in Canada. Who's going to hit somebody else, right? Well, so we have to see what the circ. I have a.
We
I have
might step on someone's toes by accident, but of course
right.
we'd apologize.
Yes, we'd apologize actually before we step on their toes in Canada.
And I've heard people apologize for having their toes in the way of someone who stepped on them.
That's right. That's right. So it sounds very foreign. I had a Rebbe who was Rev Avraham Kinerik of blessed memory, who passed away just recently. He was one of those last Rebbeim who learned in the European yeshivas. He learned in yeshivas Kamenetz, and he once told us that in the back of a shul once that he went to in Europe, there was a sign that says Asur lahakot be'egrof. You're not allowed to strike with the fist. And apparently in Europe, people would get into some really good fights. And that they're very passionate. Yeah. You've seen it. And then afterwards they kiss each other and on both sides of the cheek and they're best friends afterwards. Sometimes I think that might be healthier, like get out all your aggression. What? Yeah, let it out. Tell a person how you feel and then be done with it. But actually using physical force is not sanctioned by the Torah. Okay. And it doesn't make any distinction between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Okay. Yeah, I don't think that that's permitted, but maybe there'll be an exception offered in the halacha. We'll see. Okay. Was it going on in your lifetime, Moshe? It happened in your lifetime. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. Let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. You're not allowed to strike your fellow. As Chavero, Kasav Harambam, Kol Hamaka Adam Kasher Mi Yisrael, Bein Katan, Bein Gadol, Bein Ish, Bein Isha. Anyone who strikes a proper Jew, in other words, someone who's, an Adam Kasher, a kosher person, it doesn't matter whether the person is a minor or an adult. And it doesn't matter whether the person is male or female. If you do it derech nitzachon, if you do it in a way of dominating that other person, hareza over below sasa akam l'shana, you violate a negative commandment. Umashmos haposkim de'ein iser haka'a benachri. I don't know why he's making a point of saying this, but he says it sounds like from the poskim that this prohibition does not apply to a non-Jew. In other words, that if a Jew strikes a non-Jew, he has not violated this prohibition. And apparently maybe because, I don't know why.
These days, I wonder whether we could argue self-defense, given how that's being used. But maybe that's something that is just expectation.
Yeah.
If a Jew would ever strike a non-Jew, it could only be because they were protecting themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Shar Hatzion, he brings down from the Sefer Chasidim, who also says that you're not allowed to strike even a minor. And he doesn't understand why the Sefer Chasidim doesn't quote, why the Knesset Agdola only quotes the Sefer Chasidim and doesn't quote the Rambam. Okay, over below Sasa, Ula Malkus, I'm Lakaman Sifbeis. We'll see what the penalty is when you do strike someone in the next halacha. Russia, even lifting up your hands makes you get the title of Russia. Kasav Harama, the Rama also writes that just lifting up your hand in a threatening way to strike someone makes you puzzle for edus midrabanan. The afal pisha davar ze asr mideoraisa, But the point is, like, why does he say it only makes you pasul midirabanan? The point is that even though it's prohibited by the Torah to lift up your hand against someone, the kol makom hol she'ein bo malkus eno pasul ele midirabanan. But since you don't get lashes when you do lift up your hand, as we'll see shortly, you can't say that someone is pasul midioraisa for edus. He's only pasul midirabanan. Aval hecha shehikahu mamish bahaka sheyesh b'shava pruta. But that's only when you threaten to strike a person. But if you actually do strike a person and you cause them injury, where there's actual financial damage involved, even though in that scenario there is no malchus, you don't get lashes for that, but you do have to pay. But nonetheless, you become pasul for edus biblically. Kaven the halav yeshbal malchus ilu hiko hakasha in b'shava pruta mishum hachi gam b'shava pruta nifsal min haTorah. And the argument being is that striking someone where you don't cause a significant financial damage would get you malchus. In other words, you don't get malchus for lifting up your hand against someone, but you do get malchus when you strike someone and you don't cause them sufficient damage to make monetary restitution. If you strike them and you cause them, like they need stitches or something like that, so then you don't get malchus because the payment supersedes the malchus. But if you cause them damage that has a negligible amount of monetary damage, but has just emotional harm, so then you get malchus for that. So therefore, in that situation, since you'd be liable for malchus, you, in all scenarios, you would be pasul midioraisa. You'd be completely disqualified. Okay. So in the Likutim, he says, lahakos es chaver, you're not allowed to strike your fellow. Ish hamakeh ishto aveirahi biyado kimakeh chavero. A man who strikes his wife is no different from one Jew who strikes another Jew. In other words, spousal abuse is prohibited by the Torah. Okay. Yeah, both ways, right? And it's by the way, not a joke. I've had enough experience in the rabbinate to know that in a minority of cases there are women who are physically abusive to their husbands, sometimes we kid around about it, like here's this little woman, picking on the big guy, right? But the truth is that it can become very, very, very problematic, right? And so it doesn't make a difference whether it's the man striking the wife or the wife striking the man. He's speaking in the more common case, right? The imrogel hu bekach yesh biyad based in liyasro ulahachrimo ulahakoso b'chol minei ridui ukefia ulahashpio shelo yasaot. And if a man does this habitually, then the Beis Din has whenever they have the jurisdiction to do so, they should afflict him, ostracize him, put him under a ban, and even give him lashes in any way possible, and force him to take an oath that he will not commit it again. Those were in the good old days when Beis Din had the power to do these things. Today,
Rabbi.
Yes.
Sorry. In the Gemara, it talks about certain rabbis that have said things to other rabbis that cause them damage, or even in the case of Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Reish Lakish, that Rabbi Yochanan said something and it was a cause of Rabbi Reish Lakish to pass away. Was there any kind of damages that Rabbi Yochanan was subject to?
I don't think so. We'll have to see if emotional. I mean, we did learn at the beginning of the Sefer that inui onoas devarim is prohibited by the Torah also. The only different onoas devarim, which is causing person verbal oppression and verbal abuse, is prohibited by the Torah as well, because the Torah says velo sonu isha samisa, you may not oppress your fellow. But it falls under a different category, and there's the same kinds of high stakes as far as what a Beis Din should do to stop a person does not exist over there. But certainly, Onoas Devarim is also an Isser Deoraisa, right? But it falls under a different rubric. So, but obviously, in a case where someone is abusive to a spouse or to a child, today what we do is we report them to the authorities. And there is still a minority of rabbis in the world today who still feel that you don't report such a person to the authorities, but we don't subscribe to that. We don't subscribe to that minority opinion. We feel that that's actually morally corrupt to take such a stance. And if a person still refuses to comply by the Beis Din's orders to stop abusing his wife, according to some opinions, this is brought down by the Ramah and Even HaEzer, that we force a person to divorce his wife. In other words, we'll put her in a shelter or have her live with some people in the house, and we'll say him, sorry, your marriage is over. We're not standing for this anymore as a community. Right? So that's when there's actual physical abuse. And there are cases, but you also have to be careful on the other side also. Make sure that you verify the abuse, because there are also cases where women cry wolf. And that has also happened, so you have to know what's going on. Okay, right? And, there have been men who have been falsely accused, right, of sexual abuse or physical abuse. And you have to know for sure what the facts are. Okay. The imhikahu, and if you do strike a person, so what did we say in the halacha? The imhikahu, over below sasa, you have violated a negative commandment. Okay. Yesh omrim the adam hamukeme chavero yachol elech likvo lifnei akum. He says there are some who opine that if I've been punched or stricken by a fellow Jew, that gives me a right to go to the secular authorities. Afal pi de gorem lamaka hezek gadol, even if that will cause the striker great damage. V'ayin la'el simin ches sifav dedas harav lesor v'ayin sham Imrei Yaakov. He says in a previous chapter in Simin Ches, we discussed. We did this. This was not that long ago. Simin Ches Sif Vav. The Rab Shulchan Aruch says that that's not permitted. Let me just bring that up very quickly. It's probably Imrei Yaakov 9. There it is. Whoops. Here we go. Simin Ches Sif Vav. See, that's good because Barry has the safer, so he can just easily flip the pages. What did we say over there? It's all the way back on page Kufnun. Asr limsor Yisrael biad anas bein begupo bein memono afilu mamon kal bein bedibor lahal shenlav. So this is where the Rav Shulchan Aruch got into the Isser of being malshen, of being moiser, of giving over someone to the secular authorities, and the reason is because the Rav Shulchan Aruch lived in a time when getting someone in trouble with the secular authorities could really mean dire consequences. It was just Yud Tes Kislev. You know what Yud Tes Kislev is for Lubavitchers? That's when the Rebbe got out of jail. He was falsely imprisoned, I think, for what was the accusation, that he was collaborating with the enemy or whatever it was. In other words, Jews used to use the secular authorities to get their political or ideological opponents into trouble. And that could be one of the reasons why the Alter Rebbe, who's the author of this, it says that he has very little, actually no tolerance, zero tolerance for anyone who goes to the authorities, even if the guy deserves it. He says, and he actually says on page Kufnun Beis, V'chein mi sheragil lahakos habrios v'yefshel lahatzil mimenu elam ken yimseruhu mitzvah kol adam lamosu le'arkos shikhu mamona o shiyakatsu yado shelo yosef lahakos od. He says if a person is a habitual strong man, like he's a, what do you call him? He's a thug. He's a habitual thug, and he's constantly beating people up in the neighborhood. So then it's a mitzvah to give him over to the authorities so that they'll make him stop. But if someone just struck his friend on a one-time basis, then even the offended party does not have a right to submit him to the authorities. Why? He says even though there are poskim who say that if he does do that, we can't hold him responsible to the as far as what happens to the guy who was given over to the authorities and thrown into the dungeon or whatever, because you can't blame a person for guy got a black eye from the sky. You can't hold him responsible for what he does afterwards if he really takes it out on the guy. But mikol makom lechatchila asla divrei hakolu masr gamerhu. But nonetheless, it's still usher for a person to do that. If you were to ask a child, we would tell him you absolutely cannot. And if you do so, you're a masr. Va'afilu Yisrael ilaim she'eno rotza lavo l'dinei Yisrael asur likbal alav lifnei hasar. And even if a Jew refuses to go to Beis Din, you're not allowed to complain to the secular authorities about this Jew until you get permission explicitly from the Beis Din. And any time you want to get the secular authorities involved, even to enforce a ruling by the Beis Din, you must get the Beis Din's express permission in order to do that. Okay, so you see that the Rab Shulchan Aruch is very minimalist when it comes to the permission granted to go to the authorities, but not everyone agrees with that minimalist position. Some say that if someone strikes you and there's really nothing else that we can do about it, you report them. And that's the way we generally go today, because we should have a zero tolerance policy to any kind of physical abuse. Shehika chavero, if a person does strike his fellow, he says in the Likutim, Shliach Beis Din yachol lahagid lebeis din ve'ein bazem mishum lashon hara v'chein yachol ba'atzmo lasos din b'misariv bo lahakosa. Anyone who's appointed by the Beis Din is permitted to inform the Beis Din that someone that he went to struck him because he didn't want to comply with the instructions of the Beis Din. And there's no Isser of Lashon Hara involved. And therefore, he can actually, if a guy refuses to come to Beis Din, the Shliach Beis Din can actually use physical force to strike the guy, which is interesting. In other words, sometimes jurisdiction is granted to a proxy of the Beis Din to actually use physical force when a person refuses to comply. And ve'ein letzarfo l'minyan, you can't count him in a minyan. V'chol mishu hu kofer b'torah sheba'al peh, ein mitztaref l'chol davar shebikdusha. Anyone who denies the oral tradition also cannot be counted as part of a minyan. And of course, who can and cannot be counted as part of a minyan is subject to a lot of debate, and especially today. But we'll leave that aside for now because that's not really so germane to our discussion. Okay. Okay. Now, let's just do one quick biurim and then we'll call it a day. Now, if the Torah prohibits striking excessively a person who deserves malchus, so certainly the Torah will prohibit striking an innocent person. That was the way that the halacha was presented, and how we know that there's an isser de oraisa of striking a person. The common sif beis kasav dimiko maka kala shein bashav apruta chayv malchus min Torah. So later on, we're going to see that if you strike someone lightly where you don't cause a bruise, but you just cause him pain, you get malchus for that. The kasha demidi da'asri b'kal v'chomer ein b'malchus darein onshem min hadin. And he says if the whole halacha is derived from a kal v'chomer, that if you can't strike excessively a bad guy, certainly you cannot strike an innocent person. Normally, we don't give malchus if the whole halacha is derived from a logical argument. So how can you administer malchus to a person for striking someone if the whole source of the halacha is from a kal v'chomer? There's a principle called ein onshin min hadin. We cannot impose a penalty if the derivation of the law is non-explicit in the Torah, but is only derived through logic. And this halacha is derived through logic. It doesn't say explicitly in the Torah, do not strike your fellow man. It just says that you're not allowed to strike excessively a person who's getting malchus. And we learn a kal v'chomer from there, then surely you're not allowed to strike someone who's innocent. But if that's a logically derived halacha, how can you administer malchus for it? V'yesh lomar, the ikar halimud hu mehalav de lo yosif, the mashma lo yosif mikol makom af al hamaka chavera. He says it could be that this is not derived based on a kal v'chomer. It's based on the actual verbiage of the pasuk. It says you may not add more lashes. And that implies that whenever you are considering striking a person, you are prohibited from doing so if that person has not been sanctioned for striking. And so that is all inclusive. It's inclusive of both people who are getting malchus, and it's inclusive of people who are not getting malchus. And therefore, that when we say the term kal v'chomer, it's not really part of the derivation, but it's only there to accentuate the point that's being made. So it's not really a classic kal v'chomer in the conventional sense. Here, the prohibition is more explicit in the Torah, because the Torah says pen yosif. You are not allowed to add any physical harm to a person. So adding physical harm to a person means that whenever a person doesn't deserve to be physically harmed, you're not allowed to harm them, period. And it's therefore the Torah does not distinguish between someone who's getting malchus versus someone who's not getting malchus. And therefore it is explicit, and therefore we can administer malchus because of it. Okay, so we've successfully finished the first seif of this siman, and Amir Tzashem, we will commence next week, starting Monday, right? We're back on Monday, right? Okay, so have a good Shabbos, everyone. Shabbat Shalom, and don't hit anybody, even if he's taking the last piece of herring.